I'm here to introduce Laurie Kenschaft. Laurie describes herself as an intellectual omnivore. Her undergrad degrees from Swarthmore are in biology and religion. She got her master's from Harvard Divinity School in theological studies, and her PhD from Boston University was in American studies. I describe Laurie as a personal friend as well as an all-around fascinating person. She hosts lectures and discussions on all sorts of topics, including, but not limited to, politics, economics, charitable giving, religion, and mass incarceration. The last two being related to her positions as clerk of the First Parish Unitarian Universalist of Arlington and coordinator of their mass incarceration working group. Her diverse background gives her an interesting and informed perspectives on all of these topics. Today, she's here to talk a bit about her third book, Gender Inequality in Our Changing World. And I'll hand you off to Laurie.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for being here, particularly Jonathan for inviting me, and Tim for handling the mechanics of making the thing work. And so just a brief background, Gender Inequality in Our Changing World is a brand new textbook, sociology. I'm an historian, more or less, as we said, intellectually omnivore, but I teamed up with a couple sociologists to write this. And the reason we did this is because the sociology of gender textbooks that are out there now tend to have been written in the 1990s when there was this really sort of triumphalist sort of idea that sort of the United States is the norm, everybody's headed our way, Washington consensus, and they've had updated editions since then, but the fundamental conceptualization reflects that era. And it seemed to us that we live in a much more diverse and complicated world than we did, than people thought they did in the 1990s. And so we teamed up together to try to focus on what's going on with gender inequality in the contemporary United States, but really put it in a richly international global context and in an historical context. So we're focusing on the theme of change. How do things change? What is changing? What's changing more quickly? What's changing more slowly? All of this. It's one of those huge topics that if I'd realized what I was getting into, I probably would have said no. But in retrospect, I'm glad I said yes. And I'm very grateful that you were all here today. What I'm planning to do is what I call a flyover. It's a 450-page book or something like that, and I'm going to try to talk about it in 30 minutes. So there's no way I can touch on everything in there, but I'm just giving you a flyover perspective of what's in the book and some of the things that I think people might find interesting. I'm going to ask that while I'm going this quick speed through, people not comment or question during the slides, because several of these I included in the book because they're so interesting that if I were in a classroom, I could use them to do 20 or 30 minutes of conversation right there in the classroom, and that's not the goal for today. So, so please do not be triggered by the slides into conversation until the end, and then there will be time for Q&A. I'm going to try to keep this very hard to 30 minutes. Make sense? So the first question is, where is gender inequality? And there are three different maps that I'm going to show you that are looking at gender inequality on a global scale. This one is the United Nations has a gender inequality index, and any metric you use, any index you use has its problems. Like this one makes Saudi Arabia look sort of the same as the United States. And that's because lots and lots of women in Saudi Arabia go to a university and get high education because they're not allowed to do anything else. Their brothers are allowed to go work, play with sports, be with friends, go socialize, whatever, and all the young women can do is go to university, so they go to university. And that makes the society look like it has very good equality for women, if you measure it just by education. So clearly we have some problems with this index, but there are some patterns here that are real. It is true that by many different metrics, the United States has more gender inequality than most wealthy democracies. And the two places that are changing most quickly are China over the last 60 years and Latin America over the last 20 years. And Latin America is changing very quickly also in terms of economic inequality. It's the only region of the world in which economic inequality has decreased over the last 20 years rather than increased. So there's interesting things going on in both of those countries. And in China, that's very intentional, that the communist government, when it came in, said, women hold up half the sky. They said that girls had to get primary education, that employment had to open up to women. And it takes a while for these things to percolate through. But China's changing very quickly as a result, partly of intentional policies, but that's not all that's going on. So the next metric that I would like to offer is, this is gender gaps in life expectancies. And one of the key distinctions here that sociologists of gender, gender studies people use, is between sex and gender. Sex is what we're born with, whatever it is, whatever complicated it is, it's what we're born with related to reproductive, anatomy, and everything that goes along with that. Gender is what cultures make of that, how cultures put meaning on that. So sex, males are more likely to die at every age. That includes prenatally. So this is when nobody knows until recently what sex they are. So that has to do with sex. Gender affects how that happens, how quickly it happens, the balance between them. There are societies in which it's not true. There are societies in which women die younger. That's high level of gender inequality. There are societies in which women live much longer than men, and that is also excessively longer than men, and that is also a form of gender inequality. So the countries that are marked in red are the countries where the gender gap is too long, that men are being disadvantaged by gender. And that has a lot to do with violence, has a lot to do with alcohol, has a lot to do with risk-taking behaviors. And then the blue countries are where women are likely dying of gender, although in a few cases, I think it's because the gap is small because medical care is really good. It's not like Iceland up there is a particularly bad country for women. But that gives you another perspective on the patterns here of gender inequality. Here's another perspective on this. Again, if we have a natural sex ratio, and all of this is a little difficult to tell because what's natural because there's no culture that doesn't have culture, right? So we're sort of guessing where the natural state is. But the natural state seems to be that about 1.05 boys are born for every girl. Of course, we really should say 105 boys for every 100 girls. But, and there are a variety of countries where that's not true. So India, China, some other smaller countries have many more boys per girl than would be average born, would be natural born. And that's because of sex-selective abortion. And notice that India and China together contain about a third of the world's population. So when you have those countries selecting strongly for male births, that means we have a real disproportion in the population. The red countries are where there's too few boys born. And the reasons for that are not completely understood, but I believe that I'm sure that at least part of the answer is that when a woman is stressed during pregnancy, male fetuses are more likely to miscarry. Back to males are more likely to die at every age. Males are more fragile. So those countries are countries, I believe, in which women are so often so stressed during pregnancy that their sons in utero are more likely to die. So gender inequality affecting both the woman and the next generation. So those three ways of thinking about what's the big patterns here. There are four key causes of gender inequality that we outline in the book, and this is where the book starts. Economics. Nearly all societies use gender to allocate who does what work, and nearly all societies give men preferential access and control to economic resources. The degree of that varies a lot, how that works varies a lot, but that seems to be very, very common. Families. Nearly all societies assign the majority of unpaid family care work to women. Childcare, elder care, cooking and cleaning, and just keeping everybody alive. It seems to be women's ultimate responsibility to keep their families alive. Control of sexuality. Patrilineal societies are societies where family membership and inheritance are traced through the man's line, through the father's line. And the simple frame of that is you get the name of your father's family. But in patrilineal societies, there are many societies where only sons inherit from their fathers. Or only fathers can bequeath to their sons and daughters, but it's all through the fathers. Matrilineal societies, you trace inheritance through your mother's line. Now this results in very different types of societies because obviously we all know a given baby, we're pretty sure who the mom is. We're not necessarily sure who the father is. And so societies that are patrilineal and consider patrilineal tracing to be really important have to control women's sexuality, their reproductive capacity, and that means basically all of their behavior so that there can't be any doubts about which baby is assigned to which man. And how stringently that's done varies a lot, but there's a fundamental difference between patrilineal and matrilineal societies. The vast majority of people have lived in patrilineal societies. And then violence. Traditional societies worldwide expect the male head of household, the men who are in charge of the family and therefore the society, to maintain discipline within the families, and usually violence is an acceptable method. And in addition, nearly everywhere, the threat of sexual violence constrains women's lives in a variety of different ways. There's a lot we could say about that. So, starting with economics, the type of economic system that a society has affects the degree of gender inequality. And it's not, tight correlation, but sociology is always about loose correlations. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule. Hunting-gathering economies, you share food. You can't really own much in the way anything else because you have to be able to carry it with you. There isn't much economic inequality to be had. Horticultural economies, which use hoes and other hand tools but don't have big plows or domestic animals, big domestic animals, tend to have separate cultures for women and men. They use gender to assign the work roles very strongly, but there tends to be a sort of balance of power between them. Agricultural and pastoral or herding economies tend to be the most unequal. They tend to have what's called family economies, where the whole family, whatever that definition is, works together to keep everybody alive, to create all the things that are necessary. And the men of the family are given control of the resources that are necessary, ownership of the land or the animals, whatever their core resource is, and also the right and therefore the responsibility to control the family labor force, i.e. the women and children. So that's the most unequal type of society. In industrial economies, you begin to open up room for individuals to earn their own incomes, including for women to earn their own incomes. And that makes it possible for women to have a degree of independence that is impossible in a family economy. This affects, obviously, the women who are earning their own incomes, but it also affects women who aren't because they have that possibility available culturally, economically. And so industrialized societies tend to increase gender equality, increase the focus on the individual as the unit of decision making. Knowledge-based economies, like the one we're in, especially here in this building, value intelligence, expertise, creativity, social and relationship and emotional skills, and the ability to sit still and focus and concentrate. These are all skills that women tend to have at least as much as men. And so in knowledge-based economies, there tends to be increase in gender equality, although, as we have seen, nowhere it has become gender equal. In the United States now, if you look at young adults aged 25 to 29, 37% of the women and 30% of the men have a bachelor's degree. So we're really seeing a shift there. But if you control for education, then men earn more than women in every demographic group, including young singles, unmarried, don't have kids, the sort of most free individuals. Still, men earn more than women if you correct for education. Two key factors are important for increasing gender equality within families, again, if we look worldwide. One of them is women having access to reproductive health care, contraception, abortion, maternity care, and not having genital cutting, particularly in fibrillation. Women's lives, it just affects so many things in a woman's life if she can control when she's going to have children and if she has a really good chance of surviving childbirth, which in some societies, each time a woman gives birth, she risks dying, and her children risk ending being motherless. The other key thing is if men bond with their children and become engaged with their infants, they are much more likely to continue to care for their children throughout those children's lives. So this is where we see this sex and gender thing, that it really makes a difference when men, what's seen sociologically is that when men take paternity leave, some amount of time when their infants are small, that's long enough to bond with that child, that affects how they behave as fathers for the rest of their lives. So that requires paid paternity leave or generally paid paternity leave to be available, to have this be really common, and policies that overcome social pressures. So in most countries, maybe all countries, there's some degree of stigma against men who prioritize childcare. And the countries that have been most successful in getting men to do this are the ones that create maternity leave first, and then what's called parental leave, which can be taken by either parent. But they require men to take some amount of paternity leave dedicated for men first, and then either parent can take the parental leave. And those societies are seeing, the stats, I'm sure there's a limit to this, but for each month of paternity leave a man takes, the mother of his children, not always his wife, has a 7% increase in earnings in the future. So that's really significant. One note here is that women tend to, in the United States and other advanced countries, economically advanced countries, still are having huge what's called motherhood penalties, that when a woman is a mother, she earns less and is less likely to get hired or promoted really for the rest of her life, even if you control for experience. It's not just, oh, she took some time out of the workforce, she's a little behind in accumulating education and experience. Even if you control for that, women still earn less if they are mothers. Men, on the other hand, earn more if they are fathers. And it's not just because they tend to work more, which some men do when they have kids. They say, okay, I really need to focus on this. Even if you control for that, men tend to earn more if they are fathers, get this fatherhood bonus, as long as they do not, there are two criteria. One, if a man spends significant time taking care of his own children, then he doesn't get the fatherhood bonus. Like if he takes that paternity leave, probably won't get it. And if he has brown skin, you have to be white to get the daddy bonus. Which is related to, but not the same as, African American men are much more likely than white American men to be equal or close to equal partners around taking care of small children. So there's a lot of different factors going on here. Okay, this is one of my favorite charts. This is about control of sexuality, but using it from a more statistical point of view. If you look at the percent of people in a society saying that their society should accept homosexuality, there's a strong correlation with the per capita GDP. This is $70,000 there, zero down there. And as you can see, there's a pretty strong correlation. But there's also a lot of diversity. And that diversity, I would argue, is cultural. So there are countries or whole regions that are much more likely to accept homosexuality than others, and than predicted by their GDP. So these sort of purple dots up there, those are European countries, and they tend to be relatively embracing. These green dots here are Latin American countries, which are poor, but also more embracing for their GDP. These red countries down here are sub-Saharan Africa. Don't be born there if you're gay. And then these are Muslim majority countries, those orange dots. This is the United States, which is pretty tolerant, but not nearly as much as you would think based on its GDP, statistically. And the reason this is so important is not just because of what it means for gay folk in these societies, but also because what tolerance of homosexuality means is a belief that sexuality belongs to the individual. That in those traditional family-based patrilineal systems, sexuality belongs to the family. It is part of reproducing the family. It is part of creating that labor force. Women's bodies are very tightly controlled so that the family has its official integrity, often described as purity, kept intact. The more a society sees sexuality as an individual thing, something about individual choice, something about individual preference and pleasure and relationship, but a matter of individual choice, the more people go, hey, it's a matter of individual choice. You can choose who you're going to be with. So this is a metric for that how much a society has moved from seeing sexuality as a property of the family to seeing sexuality as a property of the individual. So it's a very important graph from that point of view. And again, this is what I mean by Latin American countries are changing quickly. Violence. Some key things to know about violence. Men commit the vast majority of violence, both at what's socially approved and what's not. And that's about maintaining social order. It's about defending the community. There's some evidence that maybe the classic Vikings were an exception to that women fought equally. But in the modern world, there don't seem to be any exceptions, and very few historically. Men are also much more likely to die violently. In 2008, They were about 3 times as likely as women. And that's common. That men worldwide, this is worldwide statistics obviously, are roughly, give or take year by year, 3 times as likely as women to die violently. But violence against girls and women lie behind many of those other forms of inequality. That's how you enforce family discipline. That's how you exclude women from the workplace and from the street. That's how a lot of these things happen. Key point, violence is not inevitable. It's not just, oh, men are going to be violent. This is back to the sex-gender thing, because levels of violence vary enormously between different societies, and within one society they can change quite quickly. They can also change over the generations. Those Vikings, those warlike, notorious Vikings, are the ancestors of the modern peaceable Scandinavians. It's the same gene pool, so it's not about the genes. And then as of 2011, violence had decreased whether one looks at decades, centuries, or millennia. And here I highly recommend Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Natures, Why Violence Has Declined. The book draws a lot on that. I can do only a little bit with it, but it's a great book. And he documented this and then talked about a variety of reasons why that's true. What's going on in Syria has caused an increase in violent deaths, but it's too soon to tell whether that's sort of a blip in the grand historical chart or whether it means some sort of trend. So this is not as true over the decades now as it was, but we may be going back. I hope so. So this is drawing again from Steven Pinker's work. When government is not trusted to provide security and justice, people have what he calls, and I call self-help justice, where in my society, if somebody robs my house, I call the police, I say, help, somebody robbed my house, and they hopefully find who did it, and they take care of it. Whereas in a traditional society, if somebody steals something from you, there's no police to call on, right? There's no government to call on. So you have to be willing to exact retribution. More to the point, you need to have a reputation to exact retribution so that they won't steal from you in the first place. And they won't beat you up in the first place. And they won't kill you in the first place. So that it's a family level thing. And that's called honor. That having that reputation for being quick to respond to insult is essential for preservation of groups in societies where there is no government that can provide protection to families. So you get this culture of male honor, which gets intertwined with this idea of female purity, the patrilineal society, family, all of that. In such societies, girls have little schooling. Women are economically dependent on their men, on their families. There's high levels of violence within the families as well as between families. High death rates, high birth rates, those need to go together. High levels of poverty, high risk of political violence and war, all of which reinforces ineffective government. There's a spiral going on here. When girls get educated, things change. This seems to be one of those levers. So women are able to contribute more economically if they're more educated. Families become more economically stable because there's more people able to do more diverse things. Child mortality decreases really quickly. Giving girls a primary education really affects the survival rates of their children. Birth rates decrease because families like, hopefully my kids will survive so I can have fewer of them. And women have more choice in whether to have children. So the next generation is better educated, it's healthier, it lives longer, and the population size stabilizes. Women have more say in their families and communities, and one of the things they do is use those families and communities to create structures that help them keep their kids alive. It seems to be one of those universal things. If you give women political power, one of the things, the first thing they go for is clean water supplies. And governments provide more public services. It's a little more complicated what women do in countries like ours in the United States, but in countries where you're just on the edge, women really like clean water. So public poverty goes down, public health improves, violence decreases, chances of war decreases. Another spiral, but going a different direction. So here's how to encourage girls' schooling in poor countries, and there's a lot of different parts of this. You need schools, but you also need the teachers and books and internet access. Quality is really important. There's a lot of places in this world where people can go to school for several years and still not really become literate or numerate. And when parents see that their girls are not getting educated, they're much more likely to take the girls out of school because girls' labor is always needed at home, always needed in families. And if the girl isn't benefiting from the schooling, girls are more likely to be withdrawn. Of course, it's good for boys, too, that they actually learn something in school. Make girls safe on the streets and in school, the violence thing. Provide safe bathrooms and sanitary supplies. There are parts of the world, like Pakistan, a third of the schools have no bathrooms and no running water. And when girls go off into the fields or whatever to relieve themselves privately, they are more likely to get assaulted. This is particularly a problem once girls start menstruating. There are places where pilot studies have just given out menstrual pads, and adolescent girls are much more likely to go to high school if they have something they can be private with. Conditional cash transfers. These are huge in particularly Brazil and Mexico are best known, but there's lots of countries around the world that are giving cash transfers to mothers, much more than fathers, because they use the money differently, but to poor families if they meet certain criteria. And typically that includes sending their kids to school and getting basic medical care, including immunizations. And that really increases both education and the well-being of the next generation. But unconditional cash transfers can work too. There's been pilot studies done, and I think it's Morocco and Malawi, where you just give families a little bit of cash, not very much, and they're much more likely to send their daughters to school because they're pulled away from that edge of survival. And many families want their daughters to go to school, they just can't afford it. Reproductive health care, again, mothers being in good shape means their daughters are more likely to go to school. And focus on disadvantaged groups. That nowadays, if you look at primary education and you look at the dominant group, I think it's every country or nearly every country, maybe every country, there's gender parity at the primary level. The place that we really hurt around gender parity on the primary level is in marginalized groups within countries. Usually ethnic groups could also be a caste. That's where you see gender inequality within the countries. So at the primary level, it gets more complicated after that. So those are key things to keep in mind when we're talking globally. Focusing on the United States, there's two things I want you to know. Gender inequality decreased by many different ways between 1970 and 2000, and since then it has leveled out. We see this map over and over and over again. And then educational levels, how much education people have, which sociologists use as a proxy for social class, has a much larger impact on life patterns now than it did in 1970 or before, or 1980 or before. So here's one of my graphs that shows this. So this red line is the frequency of rape in victim studies, where researchers get on the phone and they call households randomly selected around the country and they say, what crime have you experienced in the last 6 months? And they tabulate this. And so if that beginning spot is 1973, normalized to 100. And as you see, the incidence of rape has gone down by roughly 3/4, 80% since 1973. Big change. But it has more or less leveled out since 2000. The dotted line up there is the incidence of rape as reported to police. Most rapes are not reported, but the police reports went up and up and up during this time period when the rate was actually going down because of the work to destigmatize rape. That women became more likely to report it. Men too, but mostly women. And then since around 1995, the reports have gone down at roughly the same incidence as the, what's being done by victim studies. And then this blue line is the murder rate during this time period, again, by the same normalization. And as you see, the murder rate has gone down by roughly 50%, and there's lots, that violence in general has gone down, lots of discussion, no consensus about why that's true. But the difference between that and that, I would argue, is gender. That there is an increasing understanding that gender equality is good, that women should be able to say no, that coercion is not a desirable part of masculinity. These are all changes that are happening with gender, and that's making that difference, which is a significant difference. Another graph. This is the divorce rate per 1,000 people starting in 1870. This spike is right after World War II. Lots of people married in haste and came apart. This spike is often called the feminist movement, but I would say it's more broadly all the changes of the 1960s, which were huge. And couples didn't always change at the same pace and became much more likely to come apart. But as you see, the divorce rate has been coming down pretty steeply since then. Still high, historically speaking, but that's a trend line down, you know. But if we look more closely at different economic groups, it's all among college graduates. So these 3 lines are for people who are not college graduates, and they started in the 70s, and this is when they got married and their chance of divorcing within 10 years. So those who got married in the 70s had a significantly higher chance of divorce if they were not college graduates, but the difference is much more now than it was then. And that is the pattern that comes up in one cluster of statistics after another. Here, this is life expectancies among Americans since 1900. And as the blue lines are for black folk, and the white lines are for white folk. And the solid lines are for women, and the dotted lines are for men. That will be true in all graphs of this sort. And as you can see, in 1900, the race was the really big determining thing. We had this small gender gap, which indicates high gender inequality, and race really affected life expectancy. As the century has gone on, that's somewhat reversed. Over here, race still has an impact, gender has an impact. The gender gap for blacks is significantly higher than the gender gap for whites, but gender and race are more co-equal than they were. If we look more narrowly now to education, it's really different. This is for Americans with no high school diploma just since 1990 to 2008. And this is the line for white men, and that's the line for white women. And as you can see, life expectancies for white Americans without a high school diploma have been going down. They're now basically the same as life expectancies for black Americans without a high school diploma. And there's a lot of things that are correlated with that. Since I sent in these slides, there was a New York Times article talking about a recent study talking about levels of suicide and deaths related to substance addiction, both alcohol and illegal drugs. There's a lot of despair going on among less educated people, and that's related to all of this. So the gap for education is huge. White men with a college degree live 13 years longer than white men without a high school diploma. For white women, the gap is only 10 and a half years, but that's a decade, you know. Here, this is one of those things we could look at a lot, but we won't. This is looking at full-time earnings, median weekly earnings by gender in education since 1980. Men's earnings average decreased unless they had a bachelor's degree. These men up there with a bachelor's degree went up by a quarter in terms of their average earnings. Women's earnings increased unless they did not have a high school diploma. So the general trajectory for women and the general trajectory for men is really different. Here, men could pretty much count on earning more than women in their social world. Now, not as much. Likely, but not as much. Labor force participation rates have really changed. Men have been going down since the 1950s. Women obviously went up, but then women have also been teetering down since around 2000. Some of the reasons for men's decreasing participation rate are really good. You know, men are staying in school longer. They're taking time off to take care of kids or travel. They are retiring. That in the 1950s, the typical man died before the retirement age. Now, the typical man lives past retirement age. Big difference. Affects the labor force participation rate. This is good. And they're often in reasonably good health if they are well educated. Less educated men, however, suffer from very high levels of unemployment, underemployment, and incarceration, and they often retire or leave the workforce because they are in ill health rather than because they're ready to move on to something else. So it's a very different demographic. Here's another. If you look at percent of births to unmarried women, which is getting a lot of conversation these years, if you look at groups of women who did not go to college or had some college, there are real racial differences. But if you look at women with a college degree, those racial differences disappear. At this point, Black and Hispanic women have basically the same birth rate, whether or not they are married. For white women, there's a difference. But again, among college graduates, the differences disappear. Here's looking at those who have never married by age 40. And as you can see, there's huge differences based on race, gender, and education. For Black men without a high school diploma, it's well less than half will ever marry by age 40, which probably means ever. 2/3 of Americans say that a man has to be able to support a family before he gets married. 1/3 of Americans think the same for women. So that's part of what drives this gender difference. Obviously, lots more that could be said there. But this is a graph of the ages of people when they marry. And as you can see, back at the turn of the 20th century, it was really gender affected this a lot. And now race affects it more. That there's been a shift in what drives this, what fundamentally drives this. And this is, again, related to these ideas about financial stability. Nowadays, most people feel, and this is all ages, all genders, all race and economic groups, educational groups, feel that they need to get some sense of financial stability before they get married. They need to get themselves established professionally. That's what the college graduates call it, just some financial stability for folks who don't have a professional aspiration. And communities where many men never achieve financial stability, they don't get married. But most people want to have children in their 20s when it really works well to have children. So a lot of people and women in their 20s are often saying, I can handle raising a kid or two, and most of them have a kid or two, not lots, but I can't take on being financially responsible for a man as well. So we have huge patterns going on here. So that gives you a flavor, what I mean when I say that education is really affecting our country more than it was. Where is gender inequality headed is my final question. There are sort of different possible answers to this, and I'm not coming down on anyone's side. But one theory is that gender equality will continue to increase in the United States. So we have a lot of positive feedback loops that are just going to keep going. Knowledge-based economy. 2/3 of women and nearly half of men say they believe in the social, economic, and political equality of the sexes. Roughly half of those people describe themselves as feminists. The other half don't. But they still believe in equality of the genders. So laws not always followed, but laws prohibit gender discrimination, and they say that women have a right to refuse sex and use contraception, at least so far. And social tolerance of violence, particularly sexual violence, is decreasing, has decreased, and seems to be continuing to decrease. So all of those factors suggest that gender equality will continue to increase. Globally, nearly all big international institutions, governments, not all governments, but many governments, have realized that increasing gender equality and women's empowerment seems to be key to creating stable societies with prosperity, with economic stability, good economies, lack of violence. All of this seems to be intertwined. I'm not saying anything radically new here. World Bank will say it too. And many poor and middle income countries have started a positive cycle of more education, more women's employment, increasing health, women's empowerment. These are things, again, positive feedback cycles going in a good direction. There are theories, however, that gender equality will stagnate. As I said, in the US, metrics have stagnated since around 2000. Women still have primary responsibility for unpaid family work everywhere, even in the most egalitarian countries like Sweden, the Nordic countries. They're working on it, but it's still really women's ultimate responsibility for their families. And for less lucky and prosperous countries, ethnic groups that are marginalized or stigmatized or live in war zones often have really high levels of gender inequality along with all the other things they are suffering. And it's really hard to break those cycles for stigmatized or violence-prone areas. So theories that gender inequality will increase. Societies tend to become more stagnant and more intolerant and more full of resentment when economic situation is either level or falling. When people have a falling standard of living, they often feel like they need to find someone to blame. And this can intersect with masculinity, that if a man feels like it's his responsibility to be a breadwinner and to be therefore in control of his family, and he can't do that, men can become very resentful. And some men try to shore up their sense of masculinity by exercising it in other ways, i.e. dominating women and dominating children. So that is a pattern that has been seen in many different contexts. If the United States is headed into a period of economic decline, or some people in the United States are headed into a long period of economic decline, this pattern has its obvious risks. And other countries as well, not just the United States. And then women tend to suffer more than men from political and economic instability, from social disorder and war. Children suffer the most, right, because they're the most vulnerable. But the more a woman has to work to keep her family alive, just subsisting, the less energy she has for anything else. And climate change and environmental stresses, economic stresses, look like they are increasing. The Pentagon has put out research suggesting that there's going to be increasing economic instability, political instability, and military instability worldwide, so they're preparing for that. Again, I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but it certainly is a possibility that environmental stresses will lead to more social stresses, will lead to more gender inequality in countries where those cycles can actually reverse. So, thank you very much for listening. Questions, comments?
So the part where women are going to, graduating college now more than men, how does that track by class and race?
It's more true for families where the parents did not go to college. So in elite families, it's very likely that all of the children will go to college no matter what. Small exceptions not. But families where some people go to college and some people not, that's where you really see the differences. The girls are more likely to go. And one of the reasons for that, it is believed, is that is gender discrimination in the workforce. That at any given level of education, the boy or young man is more likely to get a job, and a better paid job, than the woman at that level. So women have to get more education in order to get economic equality. And then on top of that, women see themselves as having primary responsibility for children, so they really want to get economic stability. So there's gender issues driving the motivations in families that are less elite, less privileged.
When you talked about factors that affect a family's decision about whether to support their daughters going to school, you mostly talked about factors that were internal to the family, the economic situation or the attitudes towards the girl's education. One of the things that's been surprising watching the world news, at least for me over the last decade, is the growth of the belief of a political, cultural, that I have the right to tell other families not to send their daughters to school, that's seen as a major political plank of a group like Boko Haram or in Pakistan. And I was curious whether you see that as being the outgrowth of economic factors, or is this something that also could play into, unfortunately, one of those last three slides?
Oh, absolutely. The real answer is very complicated, as you can imagine. And I glossed over it, but that safety issue, that a lot of how the Taliban, Boko Haram, other extremist groups have deterred parents from sending their kids to school, particularly their daughters, is by making schools seem threatening, that there may be violence there. There isn't violence all the time, obviously, but if you're scared that your kid is going to get attacked, raped, killed for going to school, you're more less likely to send them to school. And I see Boko Haram literally means Western knowledge or Western education is forbidden or is taboo. And I see those movements as very much part of a reaction against Western ideology, Western colonization, and I'm not justifying it there, but saying yes, there's a global debate that's going on now. And one of the places it's playing out is on this dispute on who should have control over people's bodies, particularly girls' and women's bodies. Should it be the family and community, as it was in traditional societies, or should it be the individual? Most of the world sees the United States and Europe as saying individuals should have control over their bodies, over their destinies, over how they dress, how they behave. And the men of Boko Haram and the Taliban see that as a real threat to them as men, but also to their whole traditional society that's based on the group defining what individuals will do. So gender is one of the places that this fundamental argument over where the locus of control should be is playing out. Does that help?
So, how would you imagine the impact of the birth gender sex inequality in 15, 20 years in China, in India, or in Africa?
Right.
Now that those kids that are maturing into adults, but the gender equality is all off.
Thank you for asking. That is, it's not just in the future, it's happening now, because this has been going on as long as people have had access to ultrasounds, and that's young adults now. And so particularly in China, India, Vietnam, a few other places, you have really big disparities. And there's real concerns about the militarization that happens when a society has too many men, that they need young men. Young men who can't settle into a family are often pretty hard to control. And particularly in societies where the sense of membership, the sense of belonging is still very strongly rooted in families. That, the China, as I said, is changing very quickly, and that's partly because of the ideological changes. It's partly because of the economic changes driven by industrialization. But it isn't like a society changes instantaneously overnight. And so young men in China now know that they have really hard odds around getting married. The elite ones are going to, but the less elite ones are not. Same thing in India, where one of the things we talk about in the book is issues of rape, and we focus on India in the United States. But there are a lot of young men in India, lower status young men, who know that they're never going to be able to afford to marry. And in a society where marriage is how you get your value out of life, that can be devastating. So yes, this is already rippling through these societies. The key thing that I'm going to take the opportunity to add is that South Korea used to be in this camp. And it is, among adults, it still is. But if going back and look at the graph, now there's some sex-selective abortion going on in South Korea, but not nearly as much, not enough to show up on the map. And the reason for that, it seems, is partly ideological, preaching about gender equality and all of that. But even more, the country put in a strong public pension service for older adults. Because in traditional societies, when you get old, you need to rely on your children to keep you alive. And in traditional societies where only males can have access to good jobs and ownership of property, that means you need to have sons or you're going to be destitute. And South Korea got access to ultrasounds and good, simple abortion technology at a stage where parents still depended on their sons to survive. Industrialized societies, people tend to want to have 1, 2, maybe 3 children, sometimes 0. And so they were using sex-selective abortion to make sure they'd be secure in their old age. Once the country started putting in secure, equivalent to Social Security, the use of sex-selective abortion went down a lot. That works. Making it illegal doesn't work. It's illegal in China. It's illegal in India. It's happening. So that's the key thing there. And yes, all of this, those societies are consciously and intentionally struggling with these problems.
And do you think that would lead to more gender inequality or to greater valuation of women?
It can lead to a greater valuation of women as sexual and reproductive partners, which tends to lead to more gender inequality in the broader political and economic realm. China has had an increase in what's called wife theft or wife capture, where you grab a woman and go marry her, whether or not she was already married. That's an extreme form of gender inequality. Whether or not she consents, obviously, if it's by physical capture. And that's not happening everywhere, but that is one of the patterns that's emblematic of what happens when there's a real gender imbalance, that women get valued as sexual and reproductive objects. Thank you for coming.